Hey there, this is Craig Altrock, and this is a short session on best practices in short-term missions. This is my 20th year at Let's Start Talking. Leslie and I have been working here together that long and actually involved with Let's Start Talking a little bit longer than that. So as I said, the purpose of this presentation is to briefly talk about some best practices for short-term missions. Along the way, I'll provide some examples from Let's Start Talking, but this is not primarily a session on how LST does mission projects. Okay, so a couple of points of clarification as we get going. Actually, I'm not a huge fan of the phrase short-term missions. I know why we use it, probably primarily to differentiate a cross-cultural experience of one kind from another kind. I just wonder if sometimes when we use it, if it somehow dislodges the activity from its very logical source, because short-term missions are, after all, just an extension of the local church's mission to love God and love other people. So what we call short-term missions really just sits under that broader umbrella of loving God and loving other people wherever we go. So at Let's Start Talking, we don't really even use the phrase short-term missions. Instead, we talk about things like equipping people to share their faith in their life. We talk about seed planting. We talk about life-changing conversations and things like that. So secondly, by calling this best practices in short-term missions, we don't mean to really imply, and I don't mean to imply, that we know everything about short-term missions. What we do is very distinctive. It's done in particular context. It's arisen out of a specific set of experiences. So this is not really an attempt to tell you everything that we've learned by studying about short-term missions. It's not a compilation of all data available about short-term missions. There's a growing body of literature and resource about that. I might point you, for example, to something called Standards of Excellence that many groups have chosen to adopt, kind of an organized way to raise the bar, raise the level of excellence for short-term missions. And you can find that online, Standards of Excellence for Short-Term Missions, just as one example. But on the other hand, Let's Start Talking has been around since 1980, and we've made our fair share of mistakes, and we've learned a few things about being successful in sending people out on short-term mission experiences for 2 to 6 weeks or so. So I have a few points to share with you from that base of experience. Some of these are more philosophical in nature, some of them very practical. So use whatever is helpful here. So best practice number one, invitation and buy-in. This almost goes without saying, but it's important enough that we should just go ahead and say it. Short-term missions have the biggest impact when they have these two components. They're hosted by a local group, ideally a church, and that group has invited your mission team to come. So when you're planning your project, that raises a number of questions. Things like, so have you been invited? Believe it or not, it's not uncommon for mission groups to go serve without really having been invited to do the service they're there to do. And if you have been invited, then who's extending the invitation? Is it just coming from the host? Is it coming from the church? Just one minister? How do you know if that hosting group really has buy-in beyond just the initial invitation? And what kind of things create ownership when we're doing a project like this? So things like they have a say on when you come, on how large your group can be, on what you're going to be doing. Does the local church, that local hosting group, have a say in those things? It can also include a financial commitment on their part, one way to build ownership. So maybe they provide housing, a workspace. It's not always best for the visiting short-term group, for, like, say, your mission team, to come in and just pay for everything. That's not always the best thing to do. It's often the American thing to do, but that doesn't always create ownership. At its worst, it creates dependency, but even at its least, it can create a project, and the sense that this project is just something Americans are coming to do and not something that we, the short-term group and the hosting church, are doing together. One of the realities that Miriam Adney talks about in her article, The Myth of the Blank Slate, a checklist for short-term missions, is she talks about the realization that God is already at work at your mission site, and typically he's at work through a local group of Christians. So Christians are already there. We're not the first ones on the scene. That's almost never the case. We're not here to save the day. You may have come across this book, We're Not the Hero, A Missionary's Guide to Sharing Christ, Not a Culture of Dependency. One of the main ideas in that book is this thought about premeditated sustainability or premeditated reproducibility. It's really a book about long-term missions and engaging the mission field in such a way that that work can be carried on by local Christians in the ways that they can reproduce and sustain. But maybe in the short-term arena that we're talking about here, it's just a good reminder that there's already good work happening at your mission site, more than likely. And we're just plugging into that work, into what God's already doing there. God's already at work before we arrive, and in most cases, he's already been using his people to do that work. So we come in, really, as guests. And just like if you're invited to somebody's home for dinner, you don't walk in and start criticizing the dinner or the way they're serving the dinner. So you could use that as a metaphor for your project, that we're really coming into somebody's house, in quotes there, as guests, the mission field as guests. So for example, let's start talking. We have a set of expectations and commitments that workers sign, and one of them is the expectation is to be affirming and not critical, but the commitment we ask our workers to make is, I will affirm my missionary, my team members, and the local church. I won't criticize, correct, or debate with anyone, either in person or in my communication to people back home. There's a lot you could unpack there, but we know Americans have a tendency to come in to places, experiences, and want to fix things with money, expertise, or knowledge. But if we haven't been invited to do that, then that's not what we're going to do. So we can help team members identify and subdue paternalistic attitudes, that sense that our way is the right way. We can work on character formation issues. We can ask questions like, well, what are our hosts already doing to meet the need that we're wanting to help with? Or what could they teach us about the problems that we're trying to address there? How could we adapt what we want to do so it fits better into their context? So the question there really is just for your mission team is, who is inviting you? Who's inviting you? And how do you know that they, this local hosting group, really have buy-in? All right, number two, and we're going through these pretty quickly. Obviously, we could talk a lot more about all these. So another best practice here has to do with relationships. So this starts to get at what your mission team is actually going to do on site. You know, sometimes when people talk about short-term missions, they say, well, you know, short-term missions is primarily, it's just a learning opportunity. And I understand that, and probably for most of us, we would do well to listen a little bit more, to learn a little bit more when we go and do our short-term mission projects. But that doesn't mean that we don't have something meaningful to offer or to do while we're on site. So in most cases, real change in the lives of your team members, real change on site is delivered through the vehicle of relationships. So Christ-centered relationships are going to be the vehicle through which God is going to do some of the greatest change at the mission site into the lives of your workers. So whatever you and your host decide that your team is going to do on site, I want to encourage you to make it a priority to develop Christ-centered relationships with people who are part of the hosting church and people who are not part of the hosting church in the community. So if your work is more development oriented, then that's a challenge I'd put in front of you is, well, what can we do to develop relationships while we're doing development work? I think that's an important question to chew on and to talk to the local hosting group about how can we build relationships, not only for the sake of friendship, but to build relationships for the sake of encouraging faith and faithfulness. So the question there for your group is, what can you do on your project to develop Christ-centered relationships with local church members and with local non-believers or people who aren't part of that local church? And as a little PS here, I would say that relationship building for the sake of the kingdom, it takes time. It really does. So another benefit of focusing on relationships is it kind of keeps in check our tendency, again, maybe as Americans, but kind of as humans too, our tendency to want to see quick results from an effort. All of us want to come home from a short-term project and be able to say to our friends, our supporters, our church, our family, hey, look at what we did, and point to something specific. But relationship building isn't always quick. Sometimes it just takes time, and it's good for us to remember that some of the work that will bear the greatest fruit in the kingdom is work that just takes time because it's relationships. So sometimes what we're really doing is seed planting and not necessarily harvesting. All right, a third best practice in short-term missions has to do with extending your reach. Establish agreement on follow-up of your project ahead of time. So this is part of the conversation that we should have with our host before we get on site. How can we extend the reach of what we're doing so that when our team leaves, the work that we started, the work that we have added to continues? How can that continue after we leave? And almost always, the answer to that question is going to involve the local hosting church. So is your local hosting group, church, committed to follow up? And what have you talked about in that area? What's it going to look like? What kind of activities can they do to follow up the work that you're involved in? And even while your team is there, if you're focusing on relationships like I just talked about, how can you bridge those relationships from your team to local church members? Because remember that almost the whole time we're on site, one of the things we're thinking about is, what can I do to build these bridges, to extend our reach so that when we leave, this work continues? One quick illustration of this is on our Let's Start Talking projects. One simple, very fun activity we try to do each week is host a party where we invite the people that our team is working with, and we invite local church members together, primarily to build bridges, to build relationships between those local people. And our team is just facilitating those relationships between the local people. So especially if we're doing work that involves relationships, it's important for us to think about how we're connecting people, to local believers on site there. We have a friend named Violetta that we met down in Chile on one LST project. And when we met her, she was 30. She was single. She was from Bolivia, living in Chile. She didn't have a church home. She saw this sign about English conversation. She thought, well, maybe that's something good to do. I might meet some friends, improve my English. So she signed up. She actually read with Leslie. Well, and then she got in touch with the church through all that. And then she decided to start attending that church. She was baptized. That church became her community. And then 1 or 2 years after that, she went on her own mission project all the way to Japan. And it was a joy to see her standing in Japan as a follower of Jesus, doing her own mission project and realizing that while we had helped in a little way, helped her start or continue her journey, it was really that local church there that did the follow-up work and that nurtured that relationship and brought her into their family. That's the kind of thing that we want to see. So the question there for us is what can we do to help our short-term project have long-term effects? Number 4 has to do with fostering a good fit here. So I'm going to frame this in terms of vetting or screening potential team members in order to create a good fit between the team and the hosting church and the work that we're going to do. One of the principles that we follow at LST is that we don't take people on short-term missions just because we think it's going to be good for them. Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, it would be really good for her if she went on that project, or I think it'd be really good for them if they went. And we know what they mean. That's always well-intentioned, but short-term missions aren't always the best fit for people. So what can we do to create a good fit between the team and the host, the team and the culture, or the team and other team members there? Some of this has to do with vetting. So looking for things like the theological fit. Is it just enough to know about somebody that they believe in Christ? Maybe on certain kinds of projects, that's enough. That's all that we need to know. Maybe on other kinds of projects, we need to know a little bit more about where they are spiritually, the kind of things that they believe in. And what about the theological fit between the team and the hosting church? Again, we might not think that's so important, but actually in certain cases it can be very important. And so how can we create that kind of good fit at certain foundational levels between the team and the hosting church in terms of just kind of core theology, core theological beliefs? Just an example, some years ago, Let's Start Talking moved to a statement of faith that we ask people to sign off on. And so people that apply to go on our projects, they sign off on it. And the hosts that receive the teams, they sign off on it. And it's not something we just kind of made up out of our own heads. It's just something we pulled out of Ephesians. But it was our attempt to try to get at this kind of, how can we just ensure at that foundational level that there's a good fit here? So you've got theology. This comes into play with morality as well, or lifestyle things. Everything from smoking to same-sex attraction issues to even things like tattoos and facial hair. So some things that we think might be really important, some things we think might not be important, but maybe they're really important to the hosting church, and we didn't know that because we didn't ask. So we've just learned that we probably just need to ask those questions ahead of time to the team and the hosting church. Everything from, is it okay to wear shorts? What about flip-flops? How about pierced ears on guys? Just all those kind of issues. We've just learned we probably need to ask about that ahead of time so that we can maximize the experience that everyone is having and maximize the work that everyone is doing. So the question there is, what can we do to create a good fit between our team, the hosting church, and the work that team is going to do? All right, a couple more. So best practice has to do with training here, training the head, heart, and hands of our workers. Training in short-term missions has gotten a lot better, even just in my 20 years of experiencing short-term missions. The training has gotten a lot better. So there are a lot of good tools out there, and I think most of us, I hope, would agree that training for short-term missions is more than just teaching team members how to read an itinerary and ask a few basic phrases in the host language. So and more than just teaching people very specific things about their host culture. Sometimes it's better to back up and learn broader principles about cross-cultural interaction and team dynamics and spiritual maturity and those kind of things. So I like to look at training just simply as filling the gap. So you think about the host culture and the work that this group needs to do, and you think about, well, what would the perfect team be like? What would they know? What would they be able to do? That's the hands. And what kind of character would they have? That's the heart, the head, the knowledge, the hands, the skills, the heart, the character. That. So what would the ideal team be like? And then back up from that and think about your current team. Well, what do they know? What can they do? And what kind of character do they have? And usually then there's a gap there, and training is just a way to fill the gap. So training isn't just checking a box off and saying, okay, we got through the training. It's really part of the journey of becoming the right kind of people, so that we do our work well. We do the work that God's given us to do. There's a lot more we could say about training. That's a whole different workshop, a whole different talk. You've got areas of training like pre-project training. That's what most of us probably think about is, well, what are we going to do to prepare to go? But there's also post-project training that many groups don't think about. It's that debriefing aspect of it. We do it through things that we call end meetings. I came across a helpful metaphor, at least for me recently. Robert Priest talks about in one of his books about the metaphor of a sapling. And so, you know how when you plant a young tree, it's really flexible. So, and you can take that tree and hold it in almost any shape that you want to. He says, Robert Priest says, that when we go on a short-term project, it's often like getting bent, like a young sapling, that God uses the experience to bend us in a particular way. But sometimes when we come home, we let go, and we spring right back into the sort of shape that we were in before we went on the project. And so he likes us to think about, well, what would we need to do to maintain that shape that God was bending us in during that project? Another little metaphor along those lines is just the Emmaus story in Luke. You remember this story where two followers of Jesus are headed out of Jerusalem after the crucifixion, disappointed. Jesus joins them on the journey, and so they're with Jesus on this journey, and something significant is happening, but it's only at the end, after some reflection, that they recognize what was really happening while they were walking with Jesus. So that kind of debriefing, that kind of reflecting part of our experience. And then, of course, even on project training, or even reflection, simple things like reflection. You might not think it would be helpful or meaningful, but even a small bit of daily reflection could be really helpful. Just for example, one is we ask our LST teams to do a devotional every day, and often there's some reflecting going on there about what they're learning. Another example is on one of our family trips one year recently. At the end of the day, we would sit down and we would ask each other these questions. How did you see God at work today? What was something good that you did today? And what needs to happen in order to make tomorrow be good? Such simple questions, but they really foster a kind of, what are we experiencing? What are we really learning here? So the question for you there is just, how are you going to train your short-term mission team? How will you assure that they are trained head, heart, and hands? All right, last then, very practical, address safety and security issues. There's certainly probably some legal aspect of this in terms of duty of care, liability, and things like that. But there's also just this moral obligation to do everything that we can as leaders to ensure the security and the safety of the people that we send. So you have things like assessment, mitigation, and management. So assessment is how will you know about the potential safety and security issues at your site. Places like OSAC, great resource. They were created in the 80s to promote security cooperation between American private sector interests worldwide and the U.S. Department of State. So they've got great reports that go out regularly. The U.S. Department of State is a great resource. Their Smart Traveler Enrollment Program, U.S. Embassy sites online, and even just word on the ground. You know, your host will know things about safety in that particular site or that particular neighborhood that maybe you can't get access to online. So there's some assessing that we do. Mitigation is what will we do to reduce the likelihood of security and safety issues. So everything from, we have a general policy, just standing policy of, well, we're not going to send a team to a place where we know that there's an imminent threat of danger. And we have particular definitions of all that, but just standing policy, that's one of the ones that we follow. But so how are we going to regularly inform our workers of potential safety and security issues at their site? We talk with our workers directly about these topics and how to manage their profile while they're on site. And even simple things like health and travel coverage can go a long ways towards mitigating safety and security issues. And then just managing, well, what do we do if something really bad happens? We got to give some thought to that and planning. How are we going to manage situations when a safety security matter actually occurs during our project? And there are a lot of great resources out there, other organizations that can help you think through these kind of questions. So the question there for you and your team is, well, what are we going to do to assess, mitigate, and manage our risk? Well, there's a lot there. I could say a lot more, and maybe I've said too much already, but I hope these suggestions are helpful to you, these best practices in short-term missions. Let me end just by coming here to Luke 10. You're probably familiar with the story here. This is one of the places where Jesus sends out a group. He gives them some instructions, and they come back. Let's just read the part here at the beginning. After this, the Lord appointed 72 others and sent them out 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. He told them, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. Go, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. Don't take a purse or bag or sandals. Don't greet anyone on the road. So Jesus is he's kind of framing the experience for them, doing a little bit of prep work for them. Okay, so Jesus does that. They go out and they do the things that Jesus asked them to do. They come back. Okay, we pick it up in 17. So the 72 returned with joy and said, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. So they're having this little bit of, we would call it an end meeting, this kind of debriefing or framing of their experience. Even the demons submit to us in your name. He replied, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I've given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. However, don't rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. All right, there's a lot there too that we could try to unpack, but so there are many reasons that we go out in Jesus's name. Many reasons we go out and do what we would call a short-term mission project. From this story, I want to just remind you of one reason, because you notice here that Jesus recognizes that something special occurred when these followers went out and did their service in a short-term manner. They saw amazing things, but Jesus acknowledges that what they saw wasn't the only thing that was happening. More was happening than just what they saw during their project. And that does a couple things for us. One, it keeps us humble because it reminds us that there's a lot more happening than what we see. And there's a lot at stake here. There's a lot that's going on. There's a spiritual warfare going on. There's spiritual work happening in our project. And the second thing it does for us is it keeps us hopeful. Because maybe we are not seeing everything that's actually happening on our project, but we know by faith that something good is happening because the Lord's at work there. Well, again, as I said, I hope this is helpful to you. I appreciate the time that you've spent with me in this area, and I hope you'll take some time to check out the other booths in the other areas Um, and I pray God's rich blessing on you, and it's good to be with you. All right, we'll talk to you later. Bye.